Okay, so now I will discuss sea level, going into more details than in the previous general lecture about the Earth system. So the outline of my presentation is the following. I will start with a general introduction, then briefly discuss past sea level rise, then move to satellite altimetry, because as you know, we now measure sea level from space using altimeter satellites. I will discuss some recent improvements, then move to the sea level budget. That means can we explain what we observe in terms of components? What are the causes of sea level rise? In terms of global means, then I will discuss the internal variability, the regional variability, say a few words about sea level at the coast, and I will conclude and give you a list of some publication, relevant publication. Okay, so I start with these figures that you have already seen in the previous presentation. So saying that the Earth is currently in a state of energy imbalance. It remits less energy to space than it receives from the sun. And this causes accumulation of heat in the climate system. And as we discussed in the previous lecture, most of this heat is stored in the ocean, more than 90%. So we have seen this. And we also already have seen something identical to this picture that shows the increase in the ocean heat content through time, here since 1955, where you can see this clear upward trend in the amount of in the ocean heat content. In addition to ocean warming, land ice is melting, and here you have an image, a photograph, an image, a picture that is taken from glaciers in the Swiss Alps in 1900, and in 2008 the glacier has totally disappeared, and this is a global phenomenon. And on the bottom you can see one of the largest glaciers of the western coast of Greenland. This is the Jacobson-Isbrae glaciers that has retreated a lot, by several tens of kilometers during the last few decades. It has retreated by about 30 kilometers, or a little less, between 1851 and 2001. And then between 2001 and 2014, it retreated by more than 10 kilometers. So you can see a clear acceleration in this glacial retreat. And this is just an example, and we see that in many other places along the Greenland coast and in Antarctica. And now, because ocean is warming and because land ice is melting, sea level is rising. Ocean warming causes expansion of seawaters, so this is one of the reasons of sea level rise. And the land ice melting causes more freshwater input into the ocean, and this is the second main cause of sea level rise. So just a few words about past sea level. During the last glacial time, 20,000 years ago, sea level was about 130 meters below present-day sea level. You have a plot here. The horizontal axis is the axis is time. Here you have the ice volume, or expressed in equivalent sea level, in meter of equivalent sea level. And you can see that at the end of the deglaciation, at the end of the glacial last glacial time, the Earth become warmer, and the ice that was stored into the big ice cap that covered Canada and Scandinavia at that time started to melt, and sea level rose by about 130 meters during a period of about 10,000 years. Since about 2,000 years, we have indirect indication that the sea level has not much changed. It was almost stable, and this curve shows you have time here. Present day is here. 2,000 years ago is here. And you have a reconstruction of the global, of the mean sea level over this 2,000-year period. And you can see that it was almost stable during some period. For example, here, the medieval optimum, you can see a slight rise in sea level by about 0.6 millimeter per year, then a small decrease during the Little Ice Age. And since at the beginning of the industrial era, that is the end of the 18th century, you can see a clear rise in sea level. So, and here there is an animation that shows the global mean sea level rise since 1880. And as we will see in a moment, this is based on a reconstruction from data collected by instrument called tide gauge. Okay, so you can see that since that period, sea level is rising. So how do we know that sea level was rising during the historical period, what we call the historical period, let's say the last century? We know that from data collected by the tide gauge, mostly located along continental coastline and in some islands. The tide gauge has been developed at the origin to measure ocean tides, but for some of them we have some long records, several decades or even more than 1 century for some of them. And a number of scientists have tried to extract the information in order to know how much sea level has been rising during the past few centuries. And the result is that the estimate is that sea level has been rising between 1 and 2 millimeters per year, so as you see, very large uncertainty. But this is an order of magnitude. And the dispersion between these estimates is mostly due to the choice of the tide gauge used for the reconstruction and the corrections that we have to apply to tide gauge, because tide gauge how do you say, they are locked to the Earth's crust, and they also measure vertical motion of the Earth's crust, and in some region, this motion can be either upward, for example, in the high latitude in Scandinavia, or downward because of ground subsidence due to groundwater pumping, for example, or tectonic processes. And in order to know the amount of sea level rise, absolute sea level rise, we have to correct for this coastal motion. And this is very difficult because in most instances, we don't have the information or the needed data set to correct for that. So this leads to a very strong uncertainty. And here you have, I show you a figure of these different reconstruction. You can see that they differ. Again, this is due to the choice of the tide gauge and their poor coverage of the ocean. Anyway, this gives us, as I said, an order of magnitude. Now, since the beginning of the 90s, we measure sea level rise from space, and this is much more precise, and also we have a global view of what is going on, which is not the case with the tide gauge, that do not see what occurs in the open ocean. So the main tool to measure sea level from space is satellite altimetry. So I will briefly discuss how it works. The satellite has a radar altimeter on board that at regular time steps measure its altitude, the altitude of the satellite above the instantaneous sea surface. This is what we call the range, and this is measured by just estimating the travel time of the radar signal from the emission and after reflection on the sea surface. But the quantities that we are interested in is not this range, it is the height of the sea surface with respect to a fixed reference, and generally we use a reference ellipsoid that is a mathematical surface that more or less corresponds to the mean shape of the Earth. So this is the quantity that we want to know. And for that purpose, we need to know also the altitude of the satellite with respect to this reference ellipsoid. And this is deduced from what we call precise orbitography that is now routinely performed to know the position of all satellites in space. So I will not explain in detail how it works, but from precise orbitography we can get the altitude of the satellite with respect to the reference ellipsoid. And by difference between these two quantities, the altitude of the satellite with respect to the ellipsoid and the range measurement, we get the instantaneous sea surface. So the principle is very, as you see, very simple. So this is the basic quantity we want to know, but we have to apply a number of corrections because the radar signal is biased by its travel through the atmosphere, first of all through the ionosphere. It is delayed by the presence of electrons in the ionosphere, and it is also delayed by the presence of water vapor in the troposphere, and we have to correct for this for these factors. So there are a number of other corrections we have to apply. For example, if we are interested in sea level, and this is the purpose of this presentation, we have to correct, for example, for the ocean tides. For the solid Earth tide, you know that the solid Earth is also experiencing a periodic deformation due to the gravitational attraction of the sun and moon, and we have to correct for that, for the atmospheric loading, etc., etc. And this is the most difficult part in processing the altimetry data. This is to get a precise estimate of all this correction. So I will not discuss in too much detail. I would like just to mention that in general, most of the altimetry missions have on board a radiometer in order to measure the amount of water vapor in the troposphere, in order to get a precise estimate of the wet tropospheric correction. So the satellite, typical altimeter satellite covers the Earth, the whole Earth in a few days or weeks, and this is what we call the orbital cycle. And here you have an illustration of the coverage with the black line showing the projection of the orbit at the surface of the Earth. And at the end of one orbital cycle, the satellite flies over the same region of the Earth, and from one cycle to another, again, fly over all regions of the Earth. So this is this figure show you the evolution of the radar signal when it reflects at the surface of the sea. So this is the side view with the radar signal, the ocean surface. This is the top view of the surface. And this, the bottom panel here represents the magnitude or the amplitude of the radar signal when during its reflection on the sea surface. So, you see the evolution of this amplitude as a function of time. Again, I will not go into the technical detail, but I would like to mention that the range measurement that I mentioned previously is not the only information that we get from the altimetry system or the altimetry measurement. Two other parameters can be deduced from the shape of the radar, of the power of the radar signal, that is called also waveform. The slope of the waveform inform on the significant wave 8 at the location of the reflection of the radar signal on the sea surface, and the amplitude of the power of the return waveform informs also on surface winds. So these are two additional parameters that are useful for some application. But today we will mostly focus on the range measurements. So these are an illustration of typical waveforms from different missions. We come up to the mission, to the constellation of altimeter satellites in a moment, but just to show you that in general we have this kind of shape. Very smooth for the leading edge, and the different shapes for the remaining part of the power waveform signal. So altimetry, there have been a lot of altimetry missions that have been launched since the mid-70s. The first few missions were launched by the Americans. The very first one was GEO-3. It was a military mission, by the way, with data, confidential data, not at least at the beginning. It was followed by two other missions. Then we had the RS-1 mission launched by ESA in 1991. Another one, RS-2, in 1995. And a series of other missions, TOPEX and the JASON series in cooperation between CNES in France and NASA in the US, and VSAT, again, an ESA mission, SARAL-Altica, a French-Indian mission, and the constellation is not, okay, it's not the end of the constellation, and here you have another figure showing the constellation since the beginning of the 90s, what we call the era of high-precision altimetry. Why do we call that the high-precision altimetry era? You will see that in a moment. It's because the error of the system were very much larger for the first few missions than for this other mission. So after SARAL-Altica, we have also QuireSat, a Chinese mission, HY2A, JASON-3 Sentinel, and the Sentinel mission, Sentinel-3A and B, that are now in orbit. This table shows you a number of characteristics of a few missions. Just I want to briefly mention the length of the orbital cycle. It is on the order of 10 days for the TOPEX, Poseidon, and JASON mission, and about 1 month for the RS-1 and VSAT and the Altica mission. And there is a trade-off between the length of the orbital cycle and the spacing between tracks at the Earth's surface. The shorter the orbital cycle, the larger the distance between two tracks, the tracks. And so it's, for example, for some application, we want to have a very high resolution at the Earth's surface. So it is at the expense of the repetitivity or the length of the orbital cycle. It's important to know that. This figure shows you the footprints, square kilometer of the waveform during the reflection of the Earth's surface. And you can see that they are very different from one satellite to another. For example, for TOPEX, it was very large. It is also large for several kilometers for the TOPEX and JSON mission. It's shorter for smaller for the ERS-1 or, for example, for Sara Altica. Very small for Cryosat. So this impact, of course, the performance of the altimetry system. And here, again, another table that shows the error budget of an individual sea surface 8 measurement. So this error budget is in centimeter, and you can see the different contribution. For example, you have, for example, the radiometer, the wet troposphere contribute for 0.2 centimeter, the ocean tide 1 centimeter, and so on. So we come up with an estimate of the uncertainty of an individual single sea surface 8 measurement that is on the order of 3 to 4 centimeter for one single measurement. And here you have an estimate of the evolution of the most important error through time that affected the performance of the sea surface 8 measurement. So for GEO-3, the very first mission launched by the American in the mid-70s, you can see that the large error affecting the orbit, the orbit was not known to better than 1 meter. Then through time, the orbit error decreased, and this is based in particular due to the improvement of the Earth's gravity field and other efforts. And now, I think it's shown here, 25 years ago, an individual sea surface measurement was known to about 10 centimeters, and today it is at the level of about 1 to 2 centimeters. And here again, you have the constellation of what we call the high precision satellite altimetry that started with the launch of TOPEX Poseidon in 1992. So the application of satellite altimetry are quite various. For example, we can measure the mean sea surface, the surface of the ocean average over a long time period, and so this is for marine geophysics application. Other applications concern ocean circulation. I know that you will have lecture by Marie-Hélène Riot on that application. We can also measure tides. We can measure the two El Niño and La Niña. There are applications for operational oceanography because today we are able to forecast the state of the ocean about 2 weeks in advance, like for the atmosphere. And the last application that I will discuss in more detail now is sea level rise. And this is because the signal we want to extract from satellite altimetry is very small. This is the most complex or most demanding application of satellite altimetry. Here I would like to mention the different components of the sea surface topography that we measure with satellite altimetry. So it has two main components. One permanent component that does not vary through time, at least on time scale of years to decades. And that inform on the Earth's gravity field. This is because, on average, the sea surface is an equipotential surface of the Earth's gravity field. And its amplitude, so it has positive and negative anomalies, which amplitude varies between, let's say, around 1 meter to 100 meters. And for example, over a seamount, submarine volcano, the sea surface is deflecting upward. This is a permanent deflection. And so we can exploit the measurement of the mean sea surface in order to extract information on the marine geoid or marine gravity field. And here you have an example of the Earth's gravity map based on satellite altimetry. This is a beautiful figure that shows you all tectonic features at the seafloor. This is a map. This is a work developed in the US by colleagues David Sandwell and Walter Smith. And here it is based on Cryosat 2 satellite and JSON 1, but previously we had other maps based on, for example, IRS-1 or Geosat, etc. So you can recognize all mid-ocean ridges, for example, here in the Indian Ocean, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, volcanic chains, fracture zone, subduction zone, and so on. So this is very important for a lot of application in marine geophysics. Superimposed to this permanent sea surface, the ocean circulation produce another topography that is called the dynamic topography, from which we can deduce the ocean currents. And I will not insist because you will have again, 2 lectures on that application. I come up now to the sea level application. If we average the several hundred million measurements that have been collected by the satellite during an orbital cycle, we can estimate. We can have an estimate of the mean sea level during this orbital cycle. And from one orbital cycle to another, we can construct this kind of curve that represents the evolution of the global mean sea level. This is this curve, blue and red here. So here you have the evolution of the global mean sea level since 1993. That is at the beginning of the high precision altimetry era, so with TOPEX Poseidon missions and followed by the JSON, NVSAT, etc. So what do we see? We see that sea level is rising, but not only, we also see that there is a clear acceleration. And the black curve here is a quadratic function that has been adjusted to the data just to illustrate that sea level is accelerating. On average, the mean rate of rise is 3 millimeters per year, but as I said, we have a clear acceleration superimposed to this mean rate. So the curve, the last point here is very recent because it was collected, it corresponds to the date of 15 June of this year. Because of this global coverage, we are able also to compute the evolution of the sea level evolution at every point of the ocean. And this is illustrated on this figure that represents the spatial patterns or regional sea level trends over the whole altimetry period, or always now starting in 1993. With the colors are much better on the computers than on the screen, but so the orange color corresponds to the global mean trend, 3 millimeters per year, and the red color corresponds to region where the rate of sea level rise has been larger than the global mean. So you can see that this is in the western and south Western tropical Pacific and South Pacific, in the North Pacific, and in the Indian Ocean, some region in the Atlantic. Now, if we remove the global mean trend of 3 millimeters per year, in order to highlight this regional variability, you can see almost the same thing, but you can see much better which regions are affected by rates of sea level rise higher or faster than the global mean. I will come back to this in a moment to explain what are the reasons for that. I would like to discuss briefly 2 recent improvements in processing the altimetry data for this sea level application. Here you have a table that shows the error budget of the mean sea level estimate for different spatial scales. So I will just focus on the long-term evolution and the computation of trends over a period longer than 10 years. So now, as you have seen, we have 25 years of accurate data. So until recently, the uncertainty on the trend estimate of the global mean sea level curve was on the order of between 0.5 and 0.7 millimeter per year. It was on the order of 0.7 millimeter per year for the first mission TOPEX Poseidon, and it was a little smaller for the subsequent mission. But the requirement, in particular, the requirement proposed by GCOS, you remember GCOS, the Global Climate Observing System I discussed in the previous lectures, was to have an error level of, on the order of 0.3 millimeter per year. So we were not yet there until recently, but the Climate Change Initiative I also mentioned in the previous lectures help us to not exactly to reach the GCOS requirement, but to approach the GCOS requirement, because it has the Climate Change Initiative project for sea level allow us to a complete reprocessing on all altimetry missions, 9 altimetry missions, with a significant improvement of the orbit, so reduction of the orbit error, improvement in all geophysical correction, and also improvement between the link between the successive mission. And this led to a significant reduction of the uncertainty on the estimate of the global mean sea level trend. These are, so you have the GCOS requirement here, and the performance after the CCI, or Climate Change Initiative project. So now, at least for the trends, we approach the GCOS requirement. And we would like to do better, go beyond or below this 0.3 millimeter per year. The reason is that, as you will see in a moment, some contribution to the global mean sea level rise have an amplitude lower than 0.3 millimeter per year, and we would like to measure sea level with a better accuracy. The second improvement I would like to mention is concern the TOPEX mission. It has been, the TOPEX mission was, the TOPEX mission had 2 altimeter on boards, one called TOPEX A and the other called TOPEX B. So same instrument, but redundant. So at the time of the mission, it was known that the TOPEX EA was at instrumental problems, aging of the electronics, so the instrument was drifting. But at that time, and during the subsequent years, it was believed by the engineers and also by the scientists working on sea level that it had absolutely no impact on the estimate of the global mean sea level. And this is totally wrong. And this has been demonstrated in the recent year by different studies from the scientific communities. For example, by comparing the sea level deduced or measured by the TOPEX-A altimeter during the first 6 years of the mission, and comparing this with sea level measured by tide gauge, for example, a number of studies, this one from Australian colleagues or this one from French colleagues, showed that there was a big discrepancy between the TOPEX-A measurement and the tide gauge measurement. Another approach consisted, and this is a work that we perform in my group in Toulouse, by comparing by quantifying all contribution responsible for the global mean sea level rise with the observed sea level by satellite altimetry. I think this is the next figure. Shows that this is time here, this is sea level with a different contribution. I will come back to the contribution in a moment, but just to show you the impact of this TOPEX-A drift, we observe that we had a rather good agreement beyond 1998, but not at the beginning, and we attributed this to the TOPEX-A drift. So now we consider that we have to correct for this drift. So, and here you have a plot that showing the global mean sea level from satellite altimetry. The blue part here, during the first 6 years of the TOPEX mission, is a previous curve that was totally linear, and it was very curious to, for many years, we found that the global mean sea level was rising almost perfectly linearly, and this was surprising, but by the way, this was wrong. And now applying this correction, so you see there are different corrections proposed. There is no yet consensus on the best one, but anyway, they give rise to more or less the same results. Now the curve is no more linear, but it is the quadratic curve that I just showed you previously. Okay, so now I move to another part, which is I would like to discuss what are the causes of the present-day sea level rise. So we know that there are two main causes. I mentioned them at the beginning. So thermal expansion of ocean water. The ocean is warming, so seawater is expanding. And the second cause is an increase in the ocean mass because of freshwater input to the ocean, due to land ice melt, some exchange with land waters, I will discuss that in a moment, eventually some increase in atmospheric water vapor that give rise to sea level drop because you have more water in the ocean, in the atmosphere, and less in the ocean, and change in snow. So I will not discuss this one because they are supposed to be very small, but mostly focus on the first two. So what about thermal expansion? So we also call this component steric sea level. The steric sea level means the contribution of thermal expansion of the ocean plus change in salinity. Change in salinity can also give rise to change in sea level. But in terms of global mean, the effect is zero. But regionally, change in salinity can be important. So how do we estimate this component, the steric sea level? We can quantify it using temperature measurement at everywhere over the ocean, at different levels inside the ocean, and by integrating the temperature change and salinity change over the ocean, given ocean depths, we get this contribution. So for that purpose, and also to estimate the mass, the change in mass of the ocean, we are very fortunate because we have different observing systems, either from space or from in situ. For example, for estimating the ocean temperature, we cannot use satellite because, electromagnetic waves do not penetrate at least deep in the ocean. But we have the international program Argo, developed since the beginning of the years 2000, that provide us, I think I have a slide here, that provide us with global coverage temperature and salinity data at every level in the ocean down to 2,000 meters. And before Argo, we had some estimate of the ocean temperature mostly from ships, but with much poorer coverage. So I come back here. Okay, another very important space mission that you will see allow us to quantify the contribution to sea level rise is GRACE. I mentioned that in the previous lectures. It is a NASA DLR mission that measures the temporal change of the Earth's gravity field, from which we can deduce mass redistribution at the Earth's surface. And as you will see, from this mission, we can quantify, for example, ice mass loss from the ice sheets or from the glaciers, or change in water storage on land, etc. So the first GRACE satellite was launched in 2002. It stopped working in last fall, but GRACE follow-on has been launched recently. So we hope we will be extend this 16-year or 15-year length time series. Okay, I showed that already. And I would like to show you a number of results about the sea level budget. So sea level budget, again, is a comparison between the observed sea level and quantification of the different contributions. So there have been a lot of publications about the sea level budget during the recent years. First of all, in the successive IPCC assessment reports, the last one being published in 2013. Some more recent publication by Diang et al., I already mentioned that. Chen et al. Is an Australian team, Nerem et al., an American team, and so on. And there will be one in the recent report on the ocean under the IPCC, in the IPCC context, that currently ongoing or in progress. There are also other ongoing initiatives. I would like to mention two. The first one is an ESA project called the ESA Sea Level Budget Project that would like to assess the closure of the global mean sea level budget, but essentially using products from the CCI, Climate Change Initiative project, for the components. So the components that have been reprocessed during the CCI and the interesting sea level are the glaciers and the ice sheets. So it is a work in progress. And another initiative is an international assessment performed in the recent, during the past few months in the context of the World Climate Research Program. And here it's also, the objective is also to assess the closure of the global mean sea level budget, but in that case, using all available data set for all components, including sea level. Not just one, but and then use ensemble means, as it is currently done for climate models for projection. So this initiative involves 80 participants from 50 institutions all around the world. So the result I will show now about different components of the global mean sea level are mostly based on the second initiative, because that one, as I said, is a work in progress, so no definitive result so far. So here you have an estimate of the evolution through time of the global mean thermal expansion, or the steric component. But again, it's mostly the temperature contribution, because you remember I said that in terms of global mean, salinity has no effect on sea level. And here you have the contribution for different ocean depths. For example, for the upper ocean, 0,700 meters. This is the green curve here. The deeper oceans, 700 to 2,000 meters. This is the blue curve. And the total, from 0 to 2,000 meters, this is the red curve. What you see is that it is increasing. This is the glacier contribution, again increasing. I do not spend much time in the number, but you will see the budget in a moment. This is the contribution from the Greenland ice sheet, and this is based on different type of measurement. GRACE, I already mentioned, but also satellite altimetry, because with altimetry we can also measure the change in elevation of the ice sheet. And the third method, but this will be explained to you by Andrew Shepard later this week. The third method is a combined method that measures the velocity by INSAR, the velocity of coastal glaciers flowing into the ocean, combined with model-based estimates of the surface mass balance. So, and here you have the comparison, a curve, a series of curves showing the change in mass through time since 1990, I don't know exactly, 3, up to present. With the SWE method, you can see that at least in the beginning of the year 2000, the SWE method agree very well. So what you see is that the Greenland ice sheet is losing mass, a lot of mass, because the scale here is in gigaton. So from over the last 20 years, Greenland lose about 3,000 gigaton of ice with a clear acceleration in the recent years. This is the same kind of curve for the ice sheets, for the Antarctic ice sheet, also based on different observing methodology. And here you have the total in purple here, with the different contribution from the different regions of Antarctica. You have East Antarctica that contributed very little over the past few years. The peninsula, Antarctica Peninsula, contribute a little more. And most of what we see, and in particular the acceleration, is due to West Antarctica, that is losing mass again and in an accelerated way. You again, I do not spend time because you will have a lecture from Andrew Shepard on that topic. So there is another contribution from land waters. So you know, water is stored on land in different reservoirs, for example, in lakes, in rivers, in aquifers. And there are, because of the global water cycle, there is exchange of water between land, traveling through the atmosphere and to the ocean. So there are two main components. One is due to natural climate variability, and here you have an example of the change in land water contribution. This is expressed in sea level equivalent. You see no trend, but you see a strong interannual variability, in particular during El Niño events or ENSO events. Here you have a positive anomaly in sea level during an El Niño. This was 97, 98 El Niño. And on the opposite, you can have a negative anomaly in the global mean sea level during a La Niña event. This is the cold phase of ENSO. This is a natural variability, and you have the other component due to human activities, in particular building of dams on rivers, that lead to sea level drop because water is sequestered behind the dams. And groundwater extraction in aquifers for irrigation of culture, for agriculture in general, give rise to sea level rise. Okay, so these two contributions are about the same order of magnitude, but they have opposite sign. So it's very difficult to estimate the net effect, but so far we think that this one is contributing more than that one. So human activities are supposed to give rise to a small contribution to sea level rise. So now this is what we call an estimate of the sea level budget. As you have seen, we are able to quantify the different contributions between different using different observing systems. So here it's in terms of trends over this period, 1993 to here it's up to 2015. We have the rate of the global mean sea level from satellite altimetry, around 3 millimeters per year, as you have seen. And the different contributions, the steric contribution, thermal expansion, which is dominant, then the glaciers, Greenland, Antarctica. And because over this period it's very difficult to estimate the land water component, it's not estimated here, and it is supposed to contribute to the residual, that is the difference between the observed rate of sea level rise and the sum of all other components. So the land water is there. This is for this period. We can also try to look not only in terms of trends, because you have seen that sea level is accelerating, so trend is not necessarily a good indicator, and it's better to look at time series. And here is an example. I showed you this kind of plot previously. So this is the observed global mean sea level in black, the sum of contribution. Here the land water is taken into account with a model, an hydrological model. And you can see that on average, except at the beginning, but probably because of the poor TOPEX A correction on the global mean sea level curve, in general, we have very good agreement. So this was for the whole altimetry era. Now, for the last 10 years or 15 years now, we can use GRACE to directly measure the change in mass of the ocean rather than relying on the individual estimate of full component. And this is much more accurate because when you estimate independently, for example, the glaciers, the ice sheet, and so on, the land waters, of course, each time you have uncertainties, and the uncertainties accumulate, and it's better to directly estimate the change, the net change in mass of the ocean. We have also Argo with a global coverage. And we can also then look at the sea level budget by looking at, by summing up the thermal expansion based on Argo and the change in the mass of the ocean based on GRACE. And the result is much better, and it is expressed here for the years from starting 2005 to here it is up to 2015. So this plot compares the observed mean sea level, and here it is estimate annual average for each year from 2005. You have the observed sea level, global mean sea level, and the sum of the component. And you can see that the agreement is very good. The green bars here represent the difference, the residuals. Sometimes they are positive, sometimes they are negative, but they are very small in general, and they probably reflect uncertainty in all this contribution. Over this period, we can, as I said, the land water contribution is very difficult to estimate, but we can estimate it from GRACE as of 2005. And here is an example of this is a work that is performed by one of my postdoc in Toulouse. And so you can see that the land water contribution to sea level, this is expressed in equivalent sea level here, And you have time here. And you can see what I mentioned very briefly previously, is that it is the land water contribution is dominated by interannual variability. But there is a small trend, at least over that period. And if now we look if we don't consider only the ocean mass from GRACE, but again look at individual components, using this GRACE-based land water contribution, we almost close the sea level budget. So very good agreement between the two approaches. It is also interesting to look at, you have seen that sea level is accelerating, so why is it accelerating? Because we are able to quantify this acceleration. No, because we are able to quantify the contribution, we can say that most of the acceleration in the observed global mean sea level is due to acceleration in the loss of mass from Greenland. To a lesser extent from Antarctica. You can compare this contribution for here it's for the whole altimetry period, and here it's for the last, for the decade 2005 and 2015. And you can see that there is a much larger contribution for the recent years. Now I move to the interannual variability. If we remove the global mean trend of 3 millimeters per year from the global mean sea level curve, based on altimetry, we come up with this kind of curve with very large interannual variability. And what we observe some period of positive global mean sea level, a few millimeters. The scale is here, time is here, and some negative anomaly, again, several millimeters in terms of global mean, which is a lot. So, and it has been noticed for some time now that this totally correlates with ENSO event, or that is El Nino or La Nina events, El Nino and La Nina being the strongest natural variability of the climate system. So I will not, I am sure you all know what is El Nino and La Nina. And here, this illustrates one of the recent strong La Nina event that occurred in 2011. And if we compute the ocean mass from GRACE after removing the trend, we can see that this negative anomaly in the global mean sea level mostly is not due to thermal expansion, or it's not a temperature. It has not a temperature origin, but it has a mass origin. And several studies have shown that it is due to exchange of water with the continents. So during an El Nino, we have more rain over the tropical Pacific. So that increases the global mean sea level. And this is due to, because water is conserved in the climate system, this corresponds to less rain over tropical land. And in particular, here, for example, during the 97-98 El Nino, strong rain deficit, land water deficit over the Amazon basin. On the opposite, during the La Nina, the last strong La Nina event in 2011, we had less rain over the tropical Pacific, but more water over tropical land, and in particular over Australia. And this exchange of water between continents and ocean totally explain the interannual variability in the global mean sea level. So next topic is about the regional variability. So you remember the map showing that in some region, over the last 25 years, sea level rise was faster or larger than in other regions, and much larger, up to 2 or 3 times the global mean. And the cause, there are three potential causes to that. One is due to steric effects, that is thermal expansion plus salinity effects. Another cause is related to the solid Earth response to past and ongoing ice mass redistribution. And the third cause is atmospheric loading. So change in loading of the atmosphere that locally can change sea level. So we will see that so far, at least for the recent decades, this contribution dominates by far the other two. I don't know how much time I'm left.
Well, we're a bit ahead of schedule anyway, so you can continue.
I can continue. Okay, continue. Good. Just to illustrate the fact that it is the steric component or the effect of thermal expansion plus salinity change that dominates the regional, the spatial trend patterns in sea level observed by altimetry. This is illustrated on this figure. Here, in both cases, global mean trend have been removed to highlight the regional variability. The top panel shows you the observed sea level trends from altimetry. You have seen that already in a previous slide. And here is the steric trends computed using temperature and salinity data integrated over the ocean depths. And you can see the very high correlation between the two maps. In particular, in the Pacific, you can see, for example, North Pacific here, these patterns. In the Western tropical Pacific and South Pacific, this pattern in South Indian Ocean and so on. So it is a steric trend that today mostly explain what we observe in terms of regional variability in sea level. Just to go into more detail in this process, here you have, this is a focus on the Western tropical Pacific patterns. This is the observed trends over the altimetry era, 1993 to 2015. And here, the thermal expansion trends. You can see the perfect agreement between the two. And several publications have tried to explain why we have this kind of patterns in thermal expansion. And it has been shown that during this period, the trade winds in easterlies the trade wind intensity has increased over this period. So this led to a deepening of the thermocline. You know, I don't know if you all know what is the thermocline. It is a layer inside the upper oceans that separate the warm upper water from the colder, deeper water. So this led to a deepening of the thermocline from east to west, and because the thermocline was deeper in this region, you had more heat stored in the Western Pacific, so which led to higher, faster, higher thermal expansion, hence higher sea level rise. So clearly now the steric component dominates the pattern we see in satellite altimetry at regional scale. But there are other processes, at least that one that I would like to mention, that is negligible today, but may become very important in the future. This is linked to the solid Earth response to past and present land ice melt. You know, the Earth is solid, but it is not rigid. And when you have mass redistribution from one region to another, the Earth deforms, and the ocean basins deforms, and this also changes the gravity field, that is the mutual gravitational attraction between water and ice. and this causes regional sea level change. So just to illustrate the two, so the past process and the current process. So for the past process, this is linked to what we call post-glacial rebound. We briefly discussed before that at the last glacial maximum, the northern hemisphere, North America and Scandinavia were covered by several kilometers of ice. So because the Earth's mantle is viscous, the mantle material in the polar region moved towards the equators. And when the ice melted 10,000 years ago, or started 20,000 years ago, the mantle materials moved back from the equator to the pole. And this is, by the way, responsible for a uplift of the crust in the northern region today, in particular in Scandinavia. But this causes deformation of ocean basins and change in the gravity field. So this is one cause. And the other cause is okay, and this is the impact, sorry, before going to what is... before going to ongoing land ice melt, I would like to show you what is the impact on absolute sea level as measured by altimetry. The scale is here. I don't know if you can all see it. It is from minus 4 millimeters per year to plus 4. But what you can see is that most of the signal is around 0. So this is why I said today this process is at work, it exists, but it is so small that we are unable to measure it. Now, as you have seen, we have melting of the ice sheet, causing sea level rise, and but it also gives rise to regional variation of the global mean sea level. And here, this is based on modeling. For example, for 0.5 millimeter per year in sea level equivalent from Greenland and the same amount from melting of West Antarctica, so a total of melting of ice in terms of sea level equivalent of 1 millimeter per year, you have the regional patterns that will cause regional variability in sea level. So we have 1 millimeter per year change in ocean mass. In this example, this is a modeling example, so 1 millimeter is here. And what you can see is that we have sea level drop around the melting bodies, in the very close vicinity of the melting bodies, but sea level rise in the far field, so in the tropics. And the sea level rise, the associated sea level rise, is an amplification of about 20%. But it is so small. It is, you can see it is on the order of 4.2 millimeters per year for a change in ocean mass of 1 millimeter per year, which is about what the amount of we observe today. So 0.2 millimeters per year is still hidden into the noise of the measurements. So this is why I said we cannot detect today this kind of feature. But in the future, because we expect much more melting from Greenland and Antarctica, we expect amplification in the tropics, a significant amplification in the tropics that will be, in that case, detectable in the future decades. So the last part of this presentation concerns coastal sea level, because we have discussed global mean sea level, regional sea level. The global mean sea level is now considered as a global indicator of climate change, together with the global mean Earth temperature. So it is a very important indicator. Regional sea level is also important because in some regions there is an amplification. You have seen the case of the Western Tropical Pacific. So for the people living there, an amplification by a factor 2 or 3 is important. But what is also important everywhere is coastal sea level, because it is the quantities that affect directly the people living close to the sea. Today, we estimate that 600 million people live very near to the sea, at an altitude less than 10 meters. And it is expected that this will more than double in the coming decades. It is expected 1.4 billion people living close to the sea, very close to the sea, around 2060. So, of course, we would like to prevent from the negative impact of sea level rise. This is a list of the most important impact of global sea level, coastal sea level rise. So we expect to have temporary flooding during extreme events, permanent flooding in the very low coastal areas, shoreline erosion, shoreline retreats. Another important consequence that is already noticed in some regions, in particular in the Ganj Delta in Bangladesh, is salt intrusion in coastal aquifers, etc., etc. So the most immediate impact, together with salt intrusion, salinization of aquifers, is temporary flooding, increased temporary flooding during extreme events. Now, you have seen that with altimetry, we have information on the global mean, on the regional scale, but we oceanographers and climate scientists think that at the coast, the sea level rise or sea level change is not just an extrapolation of what is occurring at the regional scale in the open ocean, because we think that we know that a number of other processes are at work in the coastal zone. This is, for example, high-resolution ocean models show that in the coastal zone, we will have impact on sea level because of trapped Kelvin waves, because of small-scale shelf currents, in particular when you have shallow shelves, other oceanographic processes, and also because of the waves. It has been shown recently that there is a trend in wave run-up and setup that can affect coastal sea level. In deltas and estuary, the input of fresh water because of river runoff will also cause sea level change, because fresh water is lighter than salty water, and this causes sea level rise. So there are many processes that may potentially change sea level or make sea level different at the coast than in the open ocean. The problem is that the only information we have so far is from tide gauge, but you have seen at the beginning the coverage of tide gauge. In some region, there is no tide gauge at all, so we have no information on coastal sea level change. For example, just to give you an example, along the western coast of Africa, between Gibraltar, yes, I'm nearly finished, between Gibraltar and the Gulf of Guinea, there is a single tide gauge with a long record in Dakar, and no information at all, nothing at all along this huge area. We have satellite altimetry, but this does not work close to the coast. In a band of 20 to 10 kilometers from the coast, the altimetry signal is in general not interpreted. It's because the waveforms that you remember at the beginning we discussed typical. I showed the example of typical waveform or radar waveform over the open ocean, but nearby the coast, we have this kind of waveform due to, for example, reflection from land, or other processes, and this is very difficult to interpret, and it is very difficult to estimate the range. So, and just to illustrate this a little more, here you have an example of the percentage of valid altimetry data, sea surface height measurement, as a function of distance from the coast. This is the coast is here. This is 50 kilometers from the coast. So we have a lot of valid measurement in the open ocean. But when we go to the coast, the data exist, but they are not interpreted. So there are some ongoing efforts to reinterpret, reprocess this data, this altimetry data nearby the coast, by improving the correction, also the geophysical corrections that the one valid in the open ocean are not necessarily valid nearby the coast. This is the case, for example, for the ocean tide correction. And there are ongoing efforts to reprocess this data in order to get this information. Another point I would like to mention is that at the coast there is another very important process that affects sea level, in that case the relative sea level, but this is a quantity important for the humans, for the population. This is vertical land motion. If you have the ground subsiding, you have the impression that sea level is rising, but it's just the land that is subsiding. And just to show you that in Southeast Asia, the many megacities have subsided by several meters during the last few decades because of groundwater pumping for domestic use, industry, and so on. So this is my last two slides. Conclusion. So sea level is, current global mean sea level is rising, and it is not only rising, but we see a clear acceleration. We can close the sea level budget, in particular over what we call the Argo and Grace periods, since the last 15 years. And this is important because if not, this means that if we do not close the sea level budget, if we see a difference between the observed sea level and the sum of contribution, this may indicate that we are missing a contribution. And but the fact that we are closing the sea level budget indicates that we do not miss any contribution, and this is important to validate the climate models that are used for projection, because the climate models do not compute or estimate directly sea level, but they estimate the different contribution to sea level. So this means that we understand the process at work. I did not discuss that, but there have been many studies recently showing that the global mean sea level rise is very likely a consequence of anthropogenic global warming. On the other hand, in terms of regional variability, we think that what we see is still the response of the climate system to the internal natural variability. In particular, it is driven by the main climate modes like ENSO, El Niño, La Niña, we discussed previously, but also the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the North Atlantic Oscillation, and so on. So I did not discuss that, but I would like to mention that sea level will continue to rise during the following next decades. And it is not unlikely that we will have at least between 1 and 2 meters sea level, global mean sea level rise by 2100. And because of the process I discussed, we will have an amplification in the tropics by 20 to 30%. And last point, even if we stop the greenhouse gases emission tomorrow, sea level will continue to rise between many centuries, and this is mainly because of the heat that is already stored inside the ocean that will move towards the deep ocean and will be released to the atmosphere over a time scale of several centuries. And this is the very last one. I'm sorry to be a little long. I was shorter in the previous one, but a little longer here. So a few words on future prospects. What do we need for science? And this is very important, in particular here. What we need is a long, accurate global and regional sea level record for climate studies. This means sustained altimetry mission, but we are confident that we will have, at least for the next decades, new altimetry mission to take over the current one. And continuing research and research activities, because now we have an operational production, at least in Europe, of sea level data by the Copernicus Climate Change Service I mentioned in the previous lecture. We need also not only a sustained altimetry mission, but sustained observation from Argo and GRACE, and we have just GRACE follow-on launched a few weeks ago, so this is good. I discuss a lot closure of the sea level budget, and this is very important to have regular assessment, because this is important for process understanding, to constrain eventual missing contribution, but we have seen that today we don't have a large missing contribution. I did not discuss that, but it is also important to constrain the Earth energy imbalance for detection and attribution studies, that is separating the anthropogenic contribution to the natural variability contribution, and for the validation of climate models. And finally, what we need for studying the coastal impact of sea level rise, we need a multi-mission coastal altimetry dataset, and also vertical land motion, but this is more problematic. And this is a list of publications because you will have access to my presentation. You will have access to this proposed list of publications. There are many more, but I use just one slide, so I stop here.
Are there any questions for Dr. Kazanov? Yep.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My question is related to land-water contribution. How is it exactly being measured? And when we attribute the land-water contribution, it's changing because of human anthropogenic impacts. So do we see any trends pre-industrial time to now? Like, is there any trend that has been seen? And generally, it should be a decreasing contribution from land, except for flooding events. That's my assumption. Thank you.
It works? Yes. So for land waters, we have different methods to estimate them. So the first part of your question was, how do we measure? Okay. So we measure, I showed an example that with GRACE now, since over the last nearly 15 years, we are able to directly measure the total amount of water that is stored inland, but without separating the water stored in surface waters, like, for example, lakes or rivers, from the water that is stored in the first few meters of the soil, called soil moisture, from the water that is stored in deep reservoir aquifers. So, but GRACE measures the integrated water storage. But this is for at least for sea level, maybe not for hydrologists, but for sea level, it is exactly what we want to know: is the integrated land water storage change. So we can measure that with GRACE now. The only problem is that GRACE has a low resolution. I did not mention, but its ground resolution is about 300 kilometers, so it does not see very small basins, but it can see the largest basins, river basin on Earth. So otherwise, we have no other direct measurement, and there are measurements from hydrological models. So there are a lot of groups worldwide that have developed hydrological models to estimate the amount of water in these different reservoirs and how they change with time under different forcing, for example, because of change in precipitation, in meteorological parameters at the Earth's surface, and so on. So we have information from models, hydrological models, but of course, I don't know if probably you will have some illustration in a lecture on the water cycle, but if you compare the output from one model to another, there is a huge dispersion. So this is really a problem. So for sea level, GOES is the best tool to measure change in land waters and its contribution to sea level. I don't remember the second part of the question. Maybe we can.
Yeah,
maybe we are late. I can
Yeah.
discuss that during the break.
Okay. One more question. No, I'll give you a microphone. It's better that way.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question's about the measurements themselves. Is measurement of sea level from satellite altimetry, is that an all-weather product, or is it
Is it what?
all-weather? Are there
All-weather?
some weathers which you can't?
Yes. It's a radar, so it's all-weather product, and yes, definitely yes.
Okay. Well, we're a little bit. If there's one more question, then yes. I mean, let's. Is there another question? Yeah. Okay.
Well, I just wanted to know, because you mentioned that in your conclusions, like that the anthropogenic forcing on the trend that we observe is very likely. Yes. But are there actually any estimates about what part of the trend that we see now is actually still kind of a natural effect of the retreat of the cryosphere basically after the Little Ice Age, and which part can be actually attributed to human impact?
Probably Andrew Shepard will answer your question for the ice sheet, but what can I say is that how do we this is a problem of detection and attribution. Yeah. Okay, so the main approach to decide which part of the signal we see is due to anthropogenic forcing or natural or internal variability is through using climate models. The climate when the climate models are run, we can use different type of forcing, all forcing or just one forcing, and see if we reproduce what we observe. And for the global mean sea level, at least for the past century, but also for the recent decades, and in particular the altimetry period, without the anthropogenic forcing, we do not reproduce at all the curve. And there have been several publications. I can give you some reference that shows that about this is for the sea level, but in fact for the components, for thermal expansion and for the land ice melt, up to 80% of what we see today is due to anthropogenic forcing.
Okay, and this is since 1850s or
1900 or something like that. But mostly this anthropogenic forcing is really dominant since 1970, about 1970.
Okay, yes.
Okay. So I'd now like to introduce the next speaker, Professor Martin Visbeck. Martin